As with many other unequal economic and political relationships in history, a variety of ideas emerged to justify the fact of Europeans' imperial conquest of much of the rest of the globe. Perhaps the most important were ideas that have been adapted in a bastardized fashion from the writings of the leading theorist of biological evolution, Charles Darwin. This so-called social Darwinism argued that if the so-called white races of Europe had been able to dominate the rest of the globe so quickly, then it was because the white races of Europe were biologically superior to the black, the brown, the red, and the yellow races of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Of course, the idea of race is scientific nonsense, and Darwin himself never spoke of either distinct races amongst humans or even of the superiority of one species over another. Nonetheless, by the end of the 19th century, at a moment when European empire was expanding more quickly than ever, this bastardized Darwinism seemed to offer a compelling explanation to the most educated ranks of society as to how and why empire had expanded so quickly. That the explanation derived supposedly from scientific sources only added to the prestige of the ideas of social Darwinism. To the extent that the acquisition of empire was a matter of individual European states seizing what could be seized, imperial expansion always had within itself the possibility of wars amongst the competing European imperial states. Nobody was more aware of this than European statesmen themselves, particularly the leaders of the so-called great powers of Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, as they were constituted before 1914. To avoid such intra-European wars, the European leaders regularly resorted to international conferences and understandings to work out their differences peacefully, as well as to accord each other the right, so-called, to conquer specific territories in the far-flung reaches of the globe. For instance, the Berlin Conference of 1884 was held to allot the European powers zones of interest in Africa. On this basis, the Europeans gobbled up virtually the whole of the continent by 1914, with no actual fighting emerging between the European great powers. These conferences were a continuation of the so-called concert system of Europe that Best mentions, that had been devised in 1815 at the end of a quarter century of French Revolutionary Wars. Scholars have rightly seen this as a form of collective security that anticipated today's United Nations. Of course, we can take this too far. The leaders of Europe's great powers were hardly peaceniks or interested in peace for itself. They just did not want to fight each other. Indeed, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany derided the efforts of true pacifists who had gathered in The Hague in the Netherlands in 1907 to create an international law against war by saying, "I trust to my sword and God, and I shit upon their pretty resolutions." While some wanted to view imperialism as the natural consequence of the racial superiority of the Europeans, there were also critics of empire. The Americans in particular had long been critical of European imperialism. As early as the War of 1812, the United States had sought to limit European imperial expansion into the Americas, and the president at the time, James Monroe, enunciated what has come down to us as the Monroe Doctrine, which is to say, the notion that the new United States of America, founded on the principle of liberty and equal rights, had a manifest destiny to shape the future of all of the Americas from north to south. As we will see in Week 3 in particular, the Americans believed that they were a force for democracy and freedom in the world. Unlike the nasty Europeans who sought to deprive peoples of rights and create closed economic systems, the American promised free trade and democracy. To say the least, this was a rather optimistic view of what America was actually doing. As we will see in later chapters, America intervened militarily in Central and South America repeatedly through the 19th and 20th centuries, and it didn't support democratic regimes, but dictatorships of the military, of the church, and of large landowners who tended to support American economic interests. And this view of America as the agent of freedom and equality also ignored what the Americans themselves were doing within their own borders to the First Nations of North America, who had seen themselves stripped of their rights, their lands, their cultures as part of American expansion. Yet throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, America tended to believe that they acted on the world stage in a way that, while industrial and capitalist, was morally superior to that of the European empires. Indeed, it was only in the early 1900s, under the leadership of President Theodore Roosevelt, that America's leaders embraced the notion that it too should become an imperial state, and it emerged from the so-called Spanish-American War with an effective new empire in the Philippines. There were also other critics of European empire. The Japanese, for instance, rejected the notion of European racial superiority. Rather, in embracing European ways in terms of the development of their industry and armed forces, they wanted to show the world that they were on a racial par with the Europeans, although Japanese imperialists and nationalists argued for Japanese racial superiority over the Chinese and Koreans. Europeans looked askance at the idea of Japanese racial equality. At least they did so until the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War, when the Japanese inflicted a major military defeat on the Russian Empire in a brief war. Yet the most significant criticism of empire came from the places that had fallen under its direct rule: India, China, Egypt, Southeast Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. Virtually from the very moment of the imposition of European empire, national movements in all these places arose to challenge the legal, scientific, and moral authority of their new oppressors. Nationalism, the idea that we are all linked by a common language and culture if we live in a certain place, had largely been a European idea. Yet the experience of empire made it a global one too. And as we will see, throughout the 20th century, in the so-called developing world, people would heed its appeal. They would also listen to the appeal of related ideologies such as socialism. In so doing, imperialism provided 20th century history with one of its most important motive forces.